June 1945. The rain has turned the slopes of southern Okinawa into rivers of mud. Smoke hangs low over the shattered ridgelines, drifting between shattered banyan trees and broken tombs. Somewhere ahead in the dark of a limestone cave, a child is crying, thin, exhausted, almost swallowed by the distant thunder of artillery. A squad of American infantry inches forward, boots slipping, fingers tight on cold steel triggers. They have been told this ridge hides Japanese defenders. They have already seen men step from caves with grenades clutched to their chests. Every shadow looks like a trap. Every movement could be the last. Then in the gloom of the cave mouth, shapes appear. Not helmets, not rifles, women, an old man, a girl barely a teenager, and in the crook of one woman's arm, a newborn wrapped in rags already wet from the rain and the mother's sweat. Rifles rise. For a heartbeat, the war comes down to a few trembling seconds of decision. Instead of muzzle flashes, there is an outstretched hand, a blanket, a canteen of water, the tiny, stunned silence of a baby being lifted out of war and into a stranger's arms. Moments like this were not supposed to exist in a battle like Okinawa, yet they did. Moments like that did not appear out of nowhere. They were the product of years of war and fear, of decisions made in distant capitals and carried to an island most Americans had never heard of before 1945. 4 years earlier, in December 1941, the Pacific had exploded into flames. Japanese carrier aircraft had turned Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor into a graveyard of twisted steel. In the months that followed, the rising sun flag spread across Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific, Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies. An empire seemingly unstoppable stretched from Manchuria to New Guinea. But the same attack that stunned the United States also awakened an industrial giant. In 1942 and 1943, the balance began to shift. At Midway, 4 Japanese carriers went to the bottom. In the Solomons, on New Guinea in the Central Pacific, U.S. forces learned, often the hard way, how to fight an enemy that did not surrender easily. By late 1943, a new rhythm defined the war. Island after island. Atolls, jungle-clad ridges, coral reefs, Tarawa, Kwajalein, Peleliu, each name became synonymous with close-quarter killing and heavy casualties. Behind the battle lines, American planners traced arcs across maps measuring distances to the Japanese home islands. The closer the U.S. advance drew to Japan, the more civilians were caught in the path of war. On Saipan in June 1944, the pattern emerged with terrifying clarity. Thousands of Japanese civilians, steeped in years of propaganda about American barbarians, flung themselves off cliffs or clutched grenades to their chests rather than be taken. Mothers killed children, then themselves. American Marines watched people die in front of them, unable to reach them in time, shouting through interpreters that they would not be harmed. Those scenes seared themselves into American memory. They also alarmed Japanese authorities. Sacrificial death was praised in Tokyo broadcasts. Newspapers glorified Gyokuse, honorable shattered jewel, mass suicidal resistance. The phrase 100 million dying together began to circulate, a dark slogan for a nation preparing to resist to the last. At the same time, the Japanese state tightened its grip on civilian minds. From elementary school classrooms to village meetings, the message was repeated. Americans were described as Kichikubeie, bestial Anglo-Americans. Stories of invented atrocities were spread as fact: torture, dismemberment, unspeakable acts against women and children. Films, posters, and radio dramas painted a future in which surrender meant shame worse than death. For mothers, the lesson was clear. If the enemy came, they were not to be captured. Boys drilled with bamboo spears. Teenage girls practiced carrying explosives. Families dug air raid shelters, stocked with what little food they could spare, and quietly discussed in hushed tones what they might do if American troops actually reached their village. In 1944, the American cavalry of the sea drew nearer to the Japanese homeland. From newly captured Marianas airfields, B-29 superfortresses began long-range raids on Japan itself. The war was no longer something that happened overseas. It was now in the skies above Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya. Incendiary bombs turned wooden neighborhoods into oceans of flame. Japan's leaders understood that a landing on the home islands might come next. To buy time, to inflict casualties that might shock the United States into negotiation, they focused on a critical stepping stone: Okinawa. Okinawa lay just 340 miles from Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's 4 main islands. It was part of the Ryukyu chain, a subtropical arc between Taiwan and the home islands. To American planners, it was a perfect forward base. airfields for bombers and fighters, anchorages for fleets, a staging ground for any final invasion. To Tokyo, it was the outer rampart of the homeland, a buffer that had to be held long enough to make invasion look impossible. Yet Okinawa was not Tokyo. Its people spoke their own dialects, had their own customs. Many mainland Japanese looked down on them as provincial. Still, they were subjects of the emperor, and in 1944 and early 1945, the demands of total war reached them with full force. The Japanese 32nd Army began fortifying the island. Caves were expanded into bunkers. Hills were tunneled through and reinforced with concrete. Artillery was hidden in tombs and hillside galleries. Soldiers arrived by the tens of thousands, digging in for a battle they expected to be their last. Into this landscape came civilians. Farmers, fishermen, entire families from villages near newly built airstrips. Some were ordered to evacuate southward. Others were told to stay and support the troops. Schoolchildren were mobilized into student corps, carrying ammunition, tending the wounded, digging trenches. Young girls were drafted as nursing assistants, the Haimuri and other units, drilled in bandaging and sometimes in how to use grenades. By early 1945, American reconnaissance photographs showed an island turned into a fortress. Japanese orders assumed that civilians could be used as labor, as lookouts, sometimes as human shields. The official line remained unwavering: fight to the death, never surrender. Civilian suicides on Saipan and Tinian were praised as examples to follow. Beneath those orders, on the level of daily life, something more intimate was happening. Families in southern Okinawa began moving into natural caves and hand-dug shelters. They stored rice, dried sweet potatoes, a few precious belongings. As air raids increased and shelling drew near, these caves would become homes. Hospitals, headquarters, and hiding places for the very young and the very old. The stage was set. On one side, an American military machine that had learned hard lessons from Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, preparing to land an enormous invasion force. On the other, a dug-in Japanese garrison, supported and surrounded by a civilian population educated to fear capture more than death. In the spring of 1945, all of those currents of fear, doctrine, propaganda, and strategy converged on the same small, crowded strip of earth, the island of Okinawa. In late March 1945, American ships ringed Okinawa in steel. Battleships and cruisers hurled shells into the island's ridges. Carrier planes strafed and bombed roads, gun positions, and towns. Off the western coast, the sea swarmed with landing craft. Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War, was about to begin. Facing Okinawa, the U.S. 10th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., brought together 2 Marine divisions and 2 Army divisions for the initial landings, with more held in reserve. Behind them stood an immense support apparatus: Seabees to build airfields, engineers to clear mines, medics, chaplains, logistics officers. Every detail had been planned, down to the printed leaflets promising humane treatment to civilians who surrendered. Opposite them, the Japanese 32nd Army waited underground. General Mitsuru Ushijima, his fiery chief of staff Isamu Cho, and staff officers like Colonel Hiromichi Yahara had built something new in the Pacific Theater. Not a desperate stand on the beaches, but a disciplined, layered defense focused on the rugged hills of southern Okinawa. They would let the Americans land, then bleed them slowly among the ridges and ravines. On April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday and April Fool's Day, American troops stepped ashore on the Hagashi beaches on Okinawa's western coast. Instead of a wall of fire, they found only scattered resistance. By nightfall, they had pushed inland, securing airfield sites with fewer casualties than expected. Some soldiers whispered that the landing almost felt like a training exercise. The reason lay to the south. There the land rose in a series of broken ridgelines and limestone escarpments. Caves honeycombed the hills. Family tombs dotted the slopes. It was here, around the ancient capital of Shuri, that the Japanese had dug their main defensive belt. Artillery sat concealed in caves and tombs, its barrels thrust out just enough to fire before being hauled back into safety. Machine gun positions were sited to sweep likely approaches with crossing fire. The same features that made Okinawa a defensive stronghold also made it a labyrinth for civilians. Natural caves had always been part of local life, used for storage, sometimes for shelter from storms. As air raids and shelling intensified through 1944 and early 1945, families began moving into them permanently. When Japanese soldiers arrived, some caves became shared spaces, part barracks, part hospital, part civilian refuge. By the time American boots touched Hagashi's sand, tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians were already living underground. Their ears had heard both the distant thunder of naval guns and the near insistent rumble of official voices. Japanese officers and civilian officials repeated the warnings. Americans would slaughter them, violate women, bayonet bobbies. Some local leaders handed out grenades and told families they must not live to be captured. Schoolgirls in white blouses and dark skirts were formed into nursing units and told that if the line broke, they might have to die alongside the soldiers. American doctrine, at least on paper, looked very different. Orders stressed the distinction between combatants and civilians. Troops were told to avoid unnecessary killing of non-combatants, to offer medical care and food when possible. Civil affairs officers were assigned to manage refugees and restore basic services. Leaflets were printed in Japanese, promising fair treatment to those who surrendered and instructing them how to signal safely. But the paper rules met the mud and terror of real battle. In jungles and caves across the Pacific, Americans had learned that not every apparent civilian was harmless. Booby-trapped bodies, soldiers pretending to surrender then pulling grenades at the last moment, caves that looked like shelters but hid machine guns. These experiences bred caution, sometimes suspicion, and sometimes rage. On Okinawa, that tension was sharpened. As U.S. columns pushed south from the landing beaches and eastward across the island, they entered denser populations. Shelling and bombing collapsed houses and drove more civilians into the hills. Some tried to flee through the lines, white cloths tied to sticks. Others clung to their belief that capture meant torture and death, and remained hidden in caves even as food and water ran out. To bridge the gulf, American commanders leaned heavily on language. Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, from the military intelligence service deployed with frontline units. They called into caves with bullhorns, walked forward under truce flags, and pleaded in Japanese for families to surrender. Leaflets fluttered down from artillery shells or aircraft, repeating the same simple message in careful characters: "You will not be harmed if you come out." Sometimes these efforts worked. On earlier islands like Saipan and Guam, small groups of civilians had tested the promises, creeping forward with children in their arms, shaking uncontrollably. They had been given food, water, cigarettes, sometimes chocolate from care rations. Those scattered experiences moved with American units from campaign to campaign, folded into war stories told over mess kit coffee. Not every Japanese civilian would kill you. Some could be saved. Yet on Okinawa, the scale was vaster, the defenses stronger, the fear deeper. Caves that U.S. patrols approached often bore the scars of recent shell bursts. Inside, people huddled in blackness. There was almost no ventilation. Fires for cooking filled the confined spaces with smoke. Latrines were little more than a corner, fouled and buzzing with flies. Wounded soldiers lay next to small children. Food dwindled to scraps of sweet potato and grass. In some of these caverns, women went into labor. The sounds of contractions, of low, controlled groans, of newborn cries blended with the boom of distant naval guns and the closer crack of rifles. Outside, both armies shifted and clashed. Inside, families whispered about the day the Americans would find them, arguing in tight, exhausted circles over whether they should flee, surrender, or die by their own hand. Day by day, American troops closed in. Battle lines crept south over ridges whose names would become synonymous with horror: Kakazu, Sugarloaf, Shuri. For every obvious strongpoint, there were countless small caves, dugouts, and tombs whose occupants were unknown. Were they soldiers with grenades and satchel charges waiting for a final rush, or families, starving and sick, clutching the last of their belongings and the youngest of their children? Often there was no way to tell from a distance. The opening might be a black mouth in the rock, fringed with shattered branches. The habitual answer, forged in countless prior engagements, was to assume the worst, to seal caves with explosives, to fire flamethrowers into the darkness, to roll in smoke grenades and listen for panicked movement. Yet every now and then, noise answered the Americans' shouts, not with gunfire but with sobbing, pleading voices in a language most of them did not understand, punctuated by the unmistakable sound of a child crying. In those spaces of uncertainty, between doctrine and fear, between orders and instinct, the fate of the most vulnerable people on Okinawa hung in the balance, deep within those dark, airless caverns, waiting for the knock of a rifle butt or the blast of a grenade. For the civilians hiding underground, terror was not an accident of the moment. It had been carefully cultivated for years. From the 1930s onward, Japanese society had been mobilized for a future war. Schoolchildren recited imperial rescripts emphasizing loyalty and sacrifice. Textbooks described Western powers as greedy and cruel, fixed on humiliating Japan. When conflict with the United States became reality, that narrative hardened. Radio broadcasts and newspapers repeated lurid claims about Kichiku Bae, bestial Americans and British. Leaflets and handbills warned that captured women would be violated, that prisoners would be tortured and mutilated. Soldiers returning from China or Southeast Asia sometimes told half-heard stories, reshaped by fear and rumor, about what happened to those who fell into enemy hands. Each retelling made surrender seem less like an option and more like a nightmare. On islands like Saipan and Tinian, this indoctrination had already shown its power. American observers saw families leap from cliffs en masse, clutching children. They heard mothers scream apologies to the emperor before pulling grenades. Those scenes did not arise spontaneously. They were the grim fruition of a teaching that insisted that living on after capture was a betrayal of nation and family. By 1945, many Okinawan civilians had absorbed the same message, often filtered through mainland officials and officers who held them in condescending regard. Pamphlets and village meetings reinforced the idea that if the enemy came, there were only two honorable paths: active resistance, even with bamboo spears and farm tools, or collective death. For pregnant women, for parents of small children, the quiet, unspoken question became whether they could or should kill their own offspring before letting them fall into American hands. Across the water, American units approached Okinawa under very different instructions. Training films and field manuals emphasized the distinction between enemy soldiers and civilians. After bitter experience in Europe and the Pacific, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps had developed rudimentary civil affairs doctrines. Once territory was taken, non-combatants were to be registered, fed when possible, and kept out of combat zones. Commanders were told that protecting civilians was not just a moral duty but a practical one. Peaceful populations meant fewer snipers, saboteurs, and outbreaks of disease. Yet paper directives rarely survived intact at the front line. In the Central Pacific campaigns, Americans had been confronted again and again with Japanese tactics that blurred every line. Soldiers feigned surrender, waving white cloths, then detonated grenades. Wounded men lay among the dead, pulling rifles when rescuers came close. Some civilians, under compulsion or out of conviction, attacked with knives, clubs, or explosives. Every incident left its mark on units already exhausted and under constant stress. By the time divisions embarked for Okinawa, many veterans regarded any movement in the distance with equal suspicion. A figure emerging from a cave could be a mother or a machine gunner. A bundle in someone's arms might be a child or a satchel charge. Officers could repeat their orders about restraint, but the decision to squeeze a trigger or hold fire was made in split seconds by men who had seen friends die because they hesitated. Still, against that background of fear, certain habits persisted. Medics and Navy corpsmen drilled on treating all wounded regardless of uniform. Interpreters were attached to infantry companies, tasked with finding words that might convince people to risk their lives on the promise of humane treatment. And within many platoons there existed a quiet resolve that when it was absolutely clear that the figures ahead were unarmed civilians, some effort would be made to spare them. That fragile resolve would be tested most sharply in the cramped, foul-smelling darkness of the caves. Life in those caves pressed every human limit. Okinawa's porous limestone terrain was riddled with natural caverns and man-made tombs. Under the pressure of air raids, bombardment, and official orders, they became improvised shelters. Families crowded into spaces never meant for long habitation, sometimes sharing them with soldiers who used the same entrances for observation posts or firing positions. The air quickly grew thick with smoke from cooking fires and the stench of uncollected waste. Water was scarce, often a trickle from a rock seam or a few buckets carried under fire from distant wells. Food supplies dwindled as fields were abandoned and livestock killed or scattered. Children developed hollow eyes and distended bellies. The elderly weakened. Wounds, minor at first, festered without antiseptic. In some caves, disease began to spread before the first American patrol even approached. In these conditions, women continued to go into labor. Some had become pregnant before the final crisis when the war still felt distant. Others conceived during the months of mobilization when husbands or lovers passed through home villages on their way to the front. Whatever the circumstance, by the spring of 1945 their pregnancies could not be stopped. Accounts from survivors describe births on dirt floors, in the flickering light of candles or oil lamps. There were no proper tools, no clean linen, often no experienced midwives. Shell bursts outside sent dust and small stones raining from the ceiling while contractions racked bodies already weakened by hunger. Newborns entered the world coughing in smoke-laden air, their first cries almost indistinguishable from the broader noise of war outside. Mothers tried to muffle their infants' voices, fearing that any sound might draw attention and bring shells or bullets to their hiding place. Some were told by soldiers that a crying baby could betray the cave's location. The unthinkable implication hung in the air. In that moral and physical darkness, the idea of an enemy soldier one day holding such a child seemed beyond imagination. Yet the war outside drew steadily closer, step by step, to those underground births and the people who witnessed them. The moment was approaching when the owners of those small, desperate cries would meet the men they had been taught to fear most. In that encounter, all the propaganda, all the training, and all the misery of cave life would converge in a few heart-stopping seconds between life and death. First contact often began not with words, but with shape and sound. An American patrol would edge toward a black cut in the rock, rifles held low but ready. Sometimes they had a Nisei interpreter with them, calling hoarsely in Japanese for anyone inside to come out with hands visible. Sometimes there was only shouted English, punctuated by hand gestures. The reply at first was usually silence. Then a scrap of cloth might appear, trembling at the cave mouth. A white towel, a faded shirt on a stick, anything that could pass as a flag. Behind it, figures moved. Survivors later remembered the arguments in those final moments underground, who would step out first, whether to send the children ahead, whether the stories about torture and dismemberment were actually true. More than once it was the smallest who crossed the threshold before the adults. Toddlers pushed forward, older children clutching infants swaddled in what rags remained. Some were stripped half-naked by their families to show they carried no weapons. Mothers followed on their knees, heads bowed, arms raised, expecting a blow. Language failed on both sides, but fear was unmistakable. For the Americans watching, the scene cut across months of drilled-in suspicion. A bundle moved in a woman's arms, fingers tightened on triggers until the bundle shifted and a tiny hand emerged, or a thin, wavering cry rose above the wind. In those seconds, the abstract notion of civilian noncombatant became something concrete and frail. Grenades hung heavy on web belts. Flamethrower nozzles, for the moment, stayed lowered. Not all encounters ended peacefully. Some caves did conceal soldiers ready to resist, and some Americans, recalling earlier betrayals, fired rather than risk their lives. But in many cases, when it was clear that the trembling figures before them were unarmed, rifles dipped. Dry rations were pulled from packs, canteens passed forward, cigarettes offered as universal tokens. The thin wail of a newborn could now sway the split-second judgment of men who had spent weeks killing anything that moved in the wrong place. When civilians did emerge, sick and wounded, the next question was what to do with them. Into this space stepped the medics and Navy corpsmen. Their training knew no nationality. A bleeding body was a problem to be solved, whatever uniform or lack of one it wore. On Okinawa's southern ridges, aid stations sprang up in shell-scarred gullies and captured farmhouses. Canvas tarps flapped in the damp wind. Under them, stretchers lined up in rows, American wounded, Japanese prisoners, and increasingly civilians who could no longer be left in caves. Medics moved from patient to patient with the limited tools at hand: sulfa powder, morphine syrettes, bandages improvised from torn uniforms. Among the casualties were pregnant women in dangerous labor, and infants only hours or days old. Corpsmen, some barely out of their teens themselves, found their hands fumbling not with tourniquets but with the slippery, frantic limbs of newborns. There were no proper cribs, no heated wards, so they wrapped the bobbies in what they had: olive-drab blankets, spare shirts, even field jackets shrugged off in the humid air. One jacket looked much like another. It scarcely mattered that the cloth bore the insignia of the army that had shattered the island. Food for these tiny refugees was another problem. K-rations were designed for infantrymen, not infants. Yet evaporated milk, canned fruit juices, and even chocolate were pressed into unexpected service, diluted and fed carefully by spoon or improvised bottles. Older children were handed biscuits and tins, their faces a mixture of mistrust and ravenous hunger. Doctors in rear area hospitals on Okinawa later recalled wards where wounded enemy soldiers lay on adjacent cots to American GI, and where, in a corner screened off with a sheet, local women and their newborn bobbies were tended as best as resources allowed. Infection, dehydration, and trauma still claimed many. But for those who lived, their first sustained human contact with the enemy was not a blow or a shot, but a blanket being tucked a little tighter, or a medic's hand testing a tiny forehead for fever. These gestures did not erase the carnage outside. Even as blankets were wrapped around infants, artillery thundered just beyond the hill and rifle fire crackled along the next ridge. Yet precisely because of that contrast, the moments of care seared themselves into memory. In the years after the war, as Japan rebuilt and Okinawa endured a prolonged American occupation, survivors began to speak about what they had seen and felt. Many described the chasm between what they had been taught to expect and what actually happened when they stepped out of hiding. They had been warned that Americans would tear bobbies from their arms. Instead, they saw strangers in foreign uniforms rocking those same children to sleep or draping them in warm cloth. The fear did not vanish instantly. It ebbed slowly, replaced first by stunned disbelief, then by a grudging recognition that the world beyond wartime propaganda was more complicated than they had been allowed to know. American veterans, too, carried their own set of memories. Men who had lost friends to sniper fire from caves or to suicide charges spoke decades later of unexpectedly cradling a Japanese child. Some recalled the weight of a newborn in hands still shaking from combat, or the shock of meeting eyes that held no hatred, only hunger and confusion. For some, those images became the only parts of the campaign they could think about without flinching. For others, they coexisted uneasily with recollections of bodies in the mud and comrades torn apart. Moral clarity was rare. A soldier might help carry a wounded old man to a collection point in the morning and fire on another figure near a cave entrance that afternoon, never fully knowing whether he had just killed a combatant or a terrified farmer. Civilians who survived with the help of American rations sometimes carried guilt over neighbors or relatives who had chosen suicide, believing it more honorable. Yet across those tangled memories, certain moments emerged again and again in testimony from both sides. A mother pushing a child forward and whispering, "Don't shoot the baby." A medic laying his own jacket over a shivering infant. A Marine lowering his rifle because he heard, beneath the roar of battle, a cry that could only come from a newborn. These individual choices rarely altered the tactical map. They did not shorten the battle or reduce its overall toll. But taken together, they formed a thin human thread running through one of the most brutal campaigns of the Pacific War, a thread that would become most visible during the final, catastrophic collapse of the Japanese lines in the south, when entire caves disgorged their desperate occupants into the killing fields between the armies. It was in those last weeks, as the Shuri defenses crumbled and civilians flooded from their hiding places, that the plea not to kill the youngest and the response of soldiers whose job was to do exactly that to the enemy collided on a massive scale. By late May 1945, the defenses around Shuri were dissolving in rain and blood. For weeks, the hills south of Naha had been ground down under artillery and airstrikes. The ancient castle at Shuri, once the proud heart of the Ryukyu kingdom, was reduced to broken stone and mud. Beneath it, in a warren of command caves, General Ushijima and his staff read their situation reports and knew the line could not hold much longer. Orders went out in the gloom. Units were to fall back to the last defensible ground on the Kiin Peninsula at the island's southern tip. It was a withdrawal, not a rout, but it meant one terrible thing for the civilians still on Okinawa: the front line would pass over them again. Villages that had already been shelled once were hit a second time. Families who had fled south under pressure from Japanese troops now found themselves in the path of American artillery. The roads became rivers of mud, crowded with wounded soldiers, student nurses, old men pulling carts, mothers carrying what children they could still keep with them. Some Japanese officers ordered civilians to follow the army south. Others, more candid about what was coming, told them to scatter and fend for themselves. Still others, steeped in the ideology of mass sacrifice, pressed grenades and explosives into their hands and said there must be no shameful surrenders. The caves and tombs of the south filled beyond endurance. Where 20 people had huddled before, now 50 pressed together in the dark. Wounded men lay in rows. The dead were pushed to the back or left at the entrance, covered with a few stones. Air grew foul. Water ran out. The crying of children, once constant, thinned as hunger took hold. Outside, the U.S. 10th Army tightened its grip. The 96th and 7th Infantry Divisions, the 1st and 6th Marine Divisions, and other units pushed slowly southward against a determined rearguard. Every ridge seemed to hide a gun. Every depression could be mined. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. With each step, the number of caves encountered increased. American company commanders now confronted a constant dilemma: treat every hole in the rock as a fortress to be destroyed, or risk trying to coax out whoever was inside. Orders encouraged the use of interpreters and loudspeakers where possible, but they also authorized flamethrowers, demolition charges, and white phosphorus when resistance was suspected. On many slopes, the first approach was words. Nisei interpreters, their voices amplified by tinny loudspeakers, called into the darkness. They promised food, water, and safety. They warned that Japanese officers might order mass suicide, that there was no honor in throwing away children's lives. Some used Okinawan phrases they had hastily learned, hoping to bridge not just a language gap but a chasm of distrust. At first, the answers were mostly explosions. Hand grenades rolled from cave mouths. Rifle shots cracked out, aimed at the speakers. Some interpreters died within seconds of stepping into view. For the soldiers watching, every cave remained a potential death sentence. But as the Japanese defensive line shrank, and more civilians were trapped without food or hope, something began to shift. In cave after cave, the arguments inside grew more desperate. Older villagers who had lived abroad or who had heard of earlier American landings insisted that the warnings about barbarian devils might be lies. Mothers, clutching infants who no longer had milk, looked down at their children's faces and weighed starvation against the chance of capture. In those suffocating spaces, a few people began to whisper that the Americans might at least spare the youngest. In early June, along one anonymous hillside among many, an American rifle company fought its way up under intermittent sniper fire. The rain was constant, turning trenches into trenches of yellow-brown soup. Mortar shells thumped into the crest ahead. Near the top, the lead platoon halted. Ahead, a dark wedge cut into the limestone. A cave. The sergeant signaled for the flamethrower to move up. A Nisei interpreter, breathless from the climb, joined them, cupping his hands around his mouth against the wind. He shouted into the opening, promises, instructions, come out slowly, hands up, no weapons, you will not be harmed. Silence answered him. The men shifted, uneasy. The flamethrower operator knelt, readying his hose. Someone pulled the safety pin on a grenade, holding the spoon tight. Then, from the darkness, a sound reached them that cut through the hammering rain and the distant artillery. A thin, high-pitched wail, the unmistakable cry of a very young child. The interpreter seized on it. His voice rose, urgent now, slipping from formal Japanese into simpler words. Kodomo akachin, children, bobbies, come out, bring them, you will not be shot. What emerged was not a soldier with a grenade, but a woman on trembling legs, her hair matted with dust and sweat. She held a tiny bundle wrapped in rags close to her chest. Behind her, others crouched low, pushing a second woman forward, this one barely more than a girl, carrying another infant whose face was ashen with hunger. The American rifles jerked up by reflex, then hesitated. The line of civilians thickened, old men with hands raised high, teenagers holding toddlers against their hips. A few tried to speak, words tumbling out that the infantrymen could not understand. But one phrase, repeated again and again, broke through in its simplest form. A hand thrust forward, palm out, then downward toward the bundle, voices cracking around the one obvious idea, do not shoot the baby. The men on the ridge had seen booby traps and feigned surrenders. They had watched friends die because they believed an outstretched hand. In that moment, all of that experience pressed into their fingers as they gripped their weapons. What changed the balance were the sounds and the faces. The infants were too light in their mother's arms, their limbs thin, their cries weak. Their eyes, when they opened, held none of the desperate hate American troops had come to expect from enemy soldiers. They held only confusion and the dullness of exhaustion. An officer barked a command. Rifles dipped. The flamethrower's nozzle pointed to the ground. A medic, called forward, shrugged off his field jacket and stepped carefully toward the nearest woman. Slowly, making sure every movement was visible, he reached out. The mother's arms stiffened, then loosened as she realized he was not going to hit the child but to take it. The newborn was lighter than he expected. The tiny body was cold to the touch, the skin stretched tight over bone. He wrapped the baby in his own jacket, then in an olive-drab blanket from his pack, the U.S. Army insignia disappearing under the folds. Behind him, other soldiers moved along the line, offering canteens. Pressing hard biscuits and bits of chocolate into shaking hands, guiding people away from the cave mouth toward a collection point. Some Americans avoided looking directly into the civilians' eyes. Others stared, trying to reconcile what they had been told, what they had seen in previous battles, with this tableau of surrender built around the smallest, most vulnerable lives. Scenes like this one played out again and again across the shrinking pocket of southern Okinawa. Not everywhere, not always. There were still caves turned into tombs by grenades and flamethrowers. There were still cliffs where families leaped or were blown apart rather than step forward. But in a growing number of places, the same "please spare the children" met the same answer. Lowered weapons, outstretched hands, and blankets extended into a space where hours before there had been only killing. Those encounters did not stop the battle. The shelling continued, the rearguards fought on, the casualty lists lengthened. Yet as the Japanese command's options narrowed to suicide and annihilation, and the American front closed like an iron ring around the southern tip of the island, these fragile moments of mercy multiplied, turning isolated exceptions into a recognizable pattern along certain sectors of the line. And as more civilians emerged, bobbies swaddled in U.S. fabric, the war around them began quietly to change shape, from a fight over ridges and strongpoints to a struggle over how many lives and what kind of future could be pulled out of the ruins. In the last weeks of the battle, the human tide grew. By mid-June, the Shuri line had ceased to exist as a coherent defense. Japanese units were scattered across the hills and limestone knobs of the south, some still fighting, others reduced to small, hungry bands trying to slip through the American cordon. Caught among them were thousands of civilians who had followed the army south or been driven there by bombardment. For American platoons moving through this landscape, the pattern of each day became grimly familiar. They would fight their way up a ridge under fire, clear the crest, then work methodically along the reverse slope, checking every hollow, every cut in the rock. Some openings spat bullets or grenades. Others, after long minutes of shouting and waiting, produced small, blinking faces and hands frantically gesturing in surrender. Pictures taken by military photographers during these weeks show the results with stark clarity. Lines of Okinawan civilians, thin and bedraggled, file past American foxholes. Children stare into the lens, some barefoot, some clutching makeshift bundles of belongings. In more than one image, an American helmet bends over a bundle that is clearly an infant, the soldier's arms forming an awkward, protective cradle around a life he had never expected to hold. Combat cameramen recorded scenes at aid stations as well. In rough wooden structures and under stretched canvas, American medics can be seen cleaning wounds on civilians' legs and arms, setting splints on tiny limbs, and in some cases holding newborns swaddled in standard-issue blankets. Behind them, stacks of medical supplies sit beside crates of ammunition. In front of them, the patients bear the faces of the same people whose government had promised they would be butchered on sight. Field hospitals farther to the rear, the improvisation went further. Army doctors, trained for trauma surgery on soldiers, found themselves confronted with pregnant women in difficulty, mothers suffering from infections after cave births, and infants close to death from dehydration. Nurses and corpsmen scoured supply dumps for anything that could substitute for proper infant formula. Evaporated milk from C and K rations, sugar and clean water were mixed and fed in small sips. Some hospitals set aside corners of their wards as makeshift maternity and pediatric sections. American personnel, many of whom had children at home they had not seen in years, drew simple cartoon animals on cards to hang near the cots and cribs. They gave the bobbies English nicknames for the purpose of medical records, even as efforts were made to learn and record their actual names in Japanese. Each child represented a tiny victory over the larger tide of destruction outside. Word of these scenes leaked back to the front in fragments. A rifleman evacuated for wounds might return weeks later and tell his company that the civilians surrendered on their sector were now being fed and sheltered. Interpreters passed along rumors that people emerging from caves had been given rice and medicine instead of bayonets. The effect on American troops was subtle but real. It confirmed that sparing civilians did not mean condemning them to chaos behind the lines. There was a system, however improvised, to keep them alive. Among the civilians still hiding, information moved more slowly, carried by those who had risked short trips out of the hills or by refugees who slipped back toward relatives' caves in defiance of both Japanese and American patrols. Their stories were wildly inconsistent. Some spoke with horror of villages caught in crossfire. Others, with visible confusion, described how devil soldiers had given their children candy or wrapped newborns in warm cloth. These testimonies chipped away at the wall built by years of propaganda. Not completely. There were still parents who chose suicide for themselves and their children rather than trust an unknown enemy. There were still caves where soldiers enforced the old line about honorable death, sometimes at gunpoint. But as June wore on and then turned into early July, the proportion of civilians opting to surrender grew. Historians later compared Okinawa with earlier battles like Saipan and noted an important difference. Self-inflicted civilian deaths on Okinawa were numerous and tragic, especially in areas where Japanese military control remained strong. Yet the total number of civilians who survived under American control ran into the tens of thousands. U.S. Army reports counted ever-growing numbers of refugees moving through collection points and camps near the northern and central parts of the island. In many of those reports, there were specific mentions of lactating women, infants, and small children, cataloged as logistical challenges as well as humanitarian concerns. On the ground, the process of surrender became, in some places, a ritual built around the children. Individuals emerging from caves had watched for signs. When word spread that Americans were unlikely to shoot civilians who carried small children in their arms, some parents pushed their sons and daughters ahead of them, not as shields in a cynical sense, but as living arguments against being fired on. Arms were raised high. Bobbies were held even higher. As if the sight of fragile life might reach something in the men with guns that no shouted word could touch. Many American veterans interviewed decades later remembered exactly that, the moment when they saw a figure appear in a cave's mouth and their muscles tensed for a shot, and then they saw the unmistakable outline of a newborn's head against a mother's shoulder. More than tactics, more than orders, it was that image which decided them. Fingers eased off triggers. Voices dropped. Men who had shouted curses minutes before found themselves speaking more gently, gesturing with open hands rather than pointed barrels. The paradox was sharp. The same battalions that had used flamethrowers and demolition charges against fortified caves now became, in effect, unwilling guardians of the very people they had been sent to conquer. Long columns of refugees moved through areas that had been killing grounds days earlier, escorted by American troops whose uniforms were indistinguishable at a distance from those who had fired upon them. At the southern tip of Okinawa, on the cliffs and inlets around Mabuni, the last organized Japanese resistance came to an end in late June. Generals Ushijima and Cho committed ritual suicide rather than surrender. Around them, scattered remnants of units fought on or took their own lives. But even in this final spasm of resistance, civilians continued to stagger out wherever they could find a gap in the lines. By then, procedures were in place. Refugees were directed to assembly points, searched for weapons, tagged, and sent onward to larger camps. Children were weighed and measured by military doctors, their conditions noted in neat English handwriting. Bobbies born in the last days of the campaign were sometimes registered by American clerks, their first official records written not in Japanese but in the occupier's language. In the end, the total number of civilians killed on Okinawa was devastating. Estimates range around 1/4 of the island's population. Yet the number who survived, including those same infants wrapped in olive drab blankets and field jackets, was also significant. For them, the defining memory of the battle was not a specific ridge or artillery barrage, but a single instant in which men in foreign uniforms chose not to shoot. Those choices did not absolve the broader violence of the campaign. They did not erase the firestorms that had driven families into caves or the bombardments that leveled villages. But they formed a counterpoint within the larger narrative, a reminder that even at the screaming peak of industrialized warfare, individuals could and did step outside the logic of annihilation, if only long enough to protect a newborn from the rain. As the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent in July 1945, the island that had been turned into a fortress and then a graveyard slowly began to reshape itself into something else. A vast, makeshift refugee camp under American control, where the fate of those saved lives, especially the very youngest, would be decided not by bullets and grenades, but by rations, medicine, and policy.